Good evening, everyone. I'm Megan Kasafer with the New York Times, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to Get with the Times, our new live event series for college students. Tonight, we're live from Northwestern, where John Eligon and Trevor Noah will join us for a conversation around race and identity in America today. John Eligon is a New York Times national correspondent who covers America's issues with race, among other important topics. He also happens to be a Northwestern alum. Trevor Noah, someone who needs no introduction, is an author, a comedian, and host of the award-winning The Daily Show on Comedy Central. His first book, Born a Crime: Stories from a South African Childhood, was an instant New York Times bestseller. We're delighted to share that tonight, the New York Times is streaming this event to students who are hosting watch parties on college campuses across the country. You'll hear from some of them later this evening. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to John Eligon and Trevor Noah.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we're really excited to have Trevor here. We got talking race and identity, which is like, we can talk probably about 4 hours for it, but I don't think you have time for that.
It's a really simple subject.
Yes,
this is going to be fun.
But before we start, I want to thank you all joining us at Northwestern University here, the finest institution in the country, perhaps the world. And I'd like to thank everyone watching live on Facebook on nytimes.com. We thank you for joining us. We have a very riveting conversation here. But before we get started, I want to let everyone know, all the college students watching, we do want to hear back from you. We want this to be interactive. So we want to hear from you stories of how you have experienced race and ethnicity on your college campuses. We want you to send an email to oncampus@nytimes.com, and we might publish some of those on our website. So please, you can find that email address on the Facebook page, but it's oncampus@nytimes.com. And please, we do want to hear your stories and hear how this topic relates to your lives. But before we start, I think Trevor wrote a very excellent autobiography here, Born a Crime, New York Times bestseller. And I believe we're going to start with you reading a short passage from it.
You'd like me to read a passage?
Yes, please.
Oh, Lord.
Right there.
This is school all over again. All right. This will be from the chapter entitled Chameleon. As apartheid was coming to an end, South Africa's elite private schools started accepting children of all colors. My mother's company offered bursaries, scholarships for underprivileged families, and she managed to get me into a school called Maryvale College, an expensive private Catholic school. Classes were taught by nuns, mass on Fridays, the whole bit. I started preschool there when I was 3 years old, primary school when I was 5. In my class, we had all kinds of kids, black kids, white kids, Indian kids, colored kids. Most of the white kids were pretty well off. Every child of color pretty much wasn't. But because of scholarships, we all sat at the same table. We wore the same maroon blazers, the same gray slacks, and skirts. We all had the same books. We had the same teachers. There was no racial separation. Every clique was racially mixed. Kids still got teased and bullied, but it was over usual kid stuff, being fat or being skinny, being tall or being short, being smart or being dumb. I don't remember anyone being teased about their race. I didn't learn to put limits on what I was supposed to like or not like. I had a wide berth to explore myself. I had crushes on white girls, I had crushes on black girls. Nobody asked me what I was Trevor. It was a wonderful experience to have, but the downside was that it sheltered me from reality. You see, Maryvale was an oasis that kept me from the truth, a comfortable place where I could avoid making a tough decision. But the real world doesn't go away. Racism exists. People are getting hurt, and just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not happening. And at some point, you have to choose, black or white. Pick a side. You can try to hide from it. You can say, I don't pick sides, but at some point, life will force you to pick a side. At the end of grade 6, I left Maryvale to go to H.A. Jack Primary, a government school. I had to take an aptitude test before I started, and based on the results of the test, the school counselor told me, you're going to be in the smart classes, the A classes. I showed up for the first day of school, went to my classroom, And of the 30 or so kids in my class, almost all of them were white. There was one Indian kid, maybe one or two black kids, and me. Then recess came. We went out onto the playground, and black kids were everywhere. It was an ocean of black, like someone had opened a tap and all the black had come pouring out. I was like, where were they all hiding? The white kids I'd met that morning, they went in one direction. The black kids went in another direction. And I was left standing in the middle, totally confused. Were we going to meet up later on? I did not understand what was happening. I was 11 years old, and it was like I was seeing my country for the first time. In the townships, you don't see segregation because everyone is black. In the white world, anytime my mother took me to a white church, we were the only black people there. And my mom didn't separate herself from anyone. She didn't care. She'd go right up and sit with the white people. And at Maryvale, the kids were mixed up and hanging out together. Before that day, I had never seen people being together and yet not together, occupying the same space, yet choosing not to associate with each other in any way. In an instant, I could feel how the boundaries were drawn. Groups moved in color patterns across the yard, up the stairs, down the hall. It was insane. I looked over at the white kids I'd met that morning. 10 minutes earlier, I thought I was at a school where they were the majority. Now I realized how few of them there were compared to everyone else. I stood there awkwardly by myself in no man's land in the middle of the playground. Luckily, I was rescued by the Indian kid from my class, a guy named Thiessen Pillay. Thiessen was one of the few Indian kids in school, so he noticed me, another obvious outsider, right away. He ran over to introduce himself. "Hello, fellow anomaly. You're in my class. Who are you? What's your story?" We started talking and we hit it off. He took me under his wing, the artful dodger to my bewildered Oliver. Through our conversation, it came up that I spoke several African languages, and Thiessen thought a colored kid speaking black languages was the most amazing party trick. He brought me over to a group of black kids. "Say something," he told them, "and he'll show you he understands you." One kid said something in Zulu, and I replied to him in Zulu. Everyone cheered. Another kid said something in Xhosa, and I replied in Xhosa. Everyone cheered. For the rest of recess, Thiessen took me around to different black kids on the playground. "Show them your trick. Do your language thing." The black kids were fascinated. In South Africa back then, it wasn't common to find a white person or a colored person who spoke African languages. During apartheid, white people were always taught that those languages were beneath them. So the fact that I did speak African languages immediately endeared me to the black kids. "How come you speak our languages?" they asked. "Because I'm black," I said, "like you." "You're not black." "Yes, I am." "No, you're not. Have you seen yourself?" They were confused at first because of my color. They thought I was a colored person. But speaking the same languages meant that I belonged to their tribe. It just took them a moment to figure it out. It took me a moment too. At some point, I turned to one of them and said, "Hey, how come I don't see you guys in any of my classes?" It turned out they were in the B classes, which also happened to be the black classes. That same afternoon, I went back to the A classes, and by the end of the day, I realized that they weren't for me. Suddenly, I knew who my people were, and I wanted to be with them. I went to see the school counselor. "I'd like to switch over," I told her. "I'd like to go to the B classes." She was confused. "Oh no," she said. "I don't think you want to do that." "Why not?" "Because those kids are, you know." I said, "No, I don't know. What do you mean?" "Look," she said, "you're a smart kid. You don't want to be in that class." I said, "But aren't the classes the same? English is English, math is math." "Yeah, but that class is, those kids are going to hold you back. You want to be in the smart class." I said, "But surely there must be some kids in the B class who are smart." "No, they aren't." I said, "But all my friends are there." "Well, you don't want to be friends with those kids." "Yes, I do." We went back and forth. Finally, she gave me a stern warning. "You do realize the effect this will have on your future? You do understand what you're giving up? This will impact the opportunities you'll have open to you for the rest of your life." I'll take that chance. I moved to the B classes with the black kids. I decided I'd rather be held back with people I liked than move ahead with people I didn't know. Being at H.A. Jack made me realize I was black. Before that recess, I'd never had to choose. But when I was forced to choose, I chose black. The world saw me as colored, but I didn't spend my life looking at myself. I spent my life looking at other people around me. I saw myself as the people around me, and the people around me were black. My cousins are black, my mom is black, my gran is black. I grew up black because I had a white father, because I'd been in white Sunday school. I got along with the white kids, but I didn't belong with the white kids. I wasn't a part of their tribe. But the black kids embraced me. Come along, they said. You're rolling with us. With the black kids, I wasn't constantly trying to be with the black kids. I just was.
Thank you for that so much. I want to talk about the phrase "pick a team" because as I read through your autobiography, I think that was a theme that I got to sense throughout your entire life. The choices you make and how they lead to your identity, whether it be hanging out in the township in Alex, whether it be when you had to go to the jail holding cell and you had the groups, the Indians in one corner, colored people in another corner. You've come to America now. What team have you picked here?
Coming to America was an easy choice for me because I always identified and aspired to black American. You know, I remember growing up in the townships and we were poor and you knew that you didn't have, but one of the first experiences I had of seeing somebody glorify the nothingness of the world they had was black Americans. It was the first time when the hood was something that was cool. It was the first time when people actually seemed like they had an ownership of this identity as opposed to it being thrust upon them. You know, and I understand the complexities are different, you know, when you get here, but from the time I was a young man, I thought to myself, I was like, oh, I want to be a part of that culture. That's something that I can identify with. That's something I wish to join. And so coming to America, I didn't get to choose before people told me. They were just like, oh, you're black. And I was like, oh, I was going to choose black anyway, but yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Is it almost easier here? Because I mean, you can talk a little about growing up. It seemed like you were in some ways like you had to kind of figure out where you fell. You had a Swiss father,
Right.
African mother. How were you able to navigate? Is it easier here to almost identify with what you are?
I think it's easier and it's more difficult at the same time. So for those who don't know, in apartheid South Africa, the system was set up to specifically separate people by race. And when I say specifically, I mean it was very precise. So unlike America where you have a one-drop rule, in South Africa, apartheid separated people by the finest detail in their skin, by your hair. So it wasn't just black and white. It was black and white and Indian and colored. And so those things separated you. So you had some families where if a dad was just slightly darker than his kids, then that dad would have to live in a different area to the children. The children could go to a better school than maybe their dad could go to, and then the mom might be very light and she would be considered white. And this was a completely strange world for many people. So it wasn't just black or white. Coming to America, though, it's very much black or white, but then you deal with the complexities of colorism and class and a whole different identity that comes about, especially when you come from Africa. There's a whole different story that you have as an immigrant. So the race side of it is simple, and then you get into the complexities of how you interpret what is happening to you because of your race.
When I was over in South Africa, I did a story on Lindiwe Mazibuko. She used to be the head of the opposition party there, and she was a Zulu woman, but she was a bit fairer skinned. And kind of the narrative around her, because she was not with the ruling party, with the ANC, was, is she black enough? And I'm like, it's for my American audience. I'm like, she's a woman named Lindiwe who speaks Zulu. I mean, This is like as black as you can get. So I'm just kind of curious, being a fair-skinned person over here, how is your credibility as being like a man from Africa? Do people here see you as an African man? And does that bring with it a certain type of credibility about blackness that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have?
I don't know. It always varies. I can only answer that question, with regards to the people I've met. Some people have an idea of me before they meet me as a person, and when engaging in conversation, then you start to realize what you do or don't have in common. Like for instance, I found a lot of the cultural experiences I have coming from Africa are very similar to what many black Americans in the South experience, in the way you're brought up culturally, in the ideas that you have, in the ways that you address an older person, in the way you're raised within a black family. And it changes everywhere you go. The one thing I always found was black Americans were really quick and warm, in terms of welcoming me as a person once they found out I was from Africa. Like when I first lived in LA, that was my nickname in all the comedy clubs. No one bothered to learn my name. The guys at the door would just be like, "Hey, yo, it's Africa. Come on in, Africa." And I was like, I mean, there's countries as well, but whatever. Because I was like, what if another guy comes? Like, then are you going to go Africa 1, Africa 2? Just give us the countries, But I took it as it's affection. It's people in many ways seeking to connect with something that they know, I guess, takes them back to a story that was stolen from them. I've had many people coming up to me going like, "Hey man, which part of Africa do you think I'm from? And tell me about Africa and what's it like in this place?" And I go like, "Well, I haven't traveled all of it, but these are the stories I know. These are the places I've been. These are the people I've seen." But for the most part, I would say I have felt welcome. I have felt like, being African adds something to the experience that I have with African Americans.
You mentioned colorism a little bit, and how would you? In America, we talk sometimes about light skin privilege a little bit, and I assume you experienced that as well in South Africa. Can you talk about that experience in South Africa versus how does it compare to here?
Oh, I think it's very similar actually. That's one of the vestiges of racism is your color. Although you may still be in the same boat of being oppressed, your color would move you up a few rungs on the ladder of oppression, and that's something you can't deny. I know that having my skin tone may get me a few sentences further in a conversation than maybe someone who is darker than me would get. And that was common in South Africa, because in South Africa, I wouldn't be labeled as black. People would say I'm colored. And what was strange for me is growing up, I didn't grow up colored at all. Colored in South Africa is not just your skin tone, it's a culture. It's a culture of people who have an identity, have their own dialect within a language, have a food, a tradition, a way of living, and it's beautiful, and they've created something from a very dark past, but that's not how I grew up. And so I never shunned it. I was like, yeah, if you want to call me colored, I understand why. But I always say I'm colored by color, but not by culture. Because the only reality I knew was growing up in a Xhosa household. From my grandmother to my mom to my aunt, it was a matriarchal house that defined how I lived. So I did experience that at times, where people would go, "Oh, you're not black like the rest of them." That's what they would say sometimes in South Africa. They'd be like, "Oh, you're not like the rest of them. Hey, you're one of the good ones." That's what they would say. And so you came, you come to realize in life, you go like, "Oh, I see this. I see how people feel like they can team up with you against people who you actually see as your team, because they think that you're willing to step away from it, which is really interesting."
Do they do that based off skin tone? Because I feel like that happens here a lot. Like people know, I'm a New York Times reporter. If I'm a black person who's a banker, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're not like the rest of them.
Right.
You're not one of them." Is it based strictly on, like, do they look at skin tone there? Is that how they figure it out, or is that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's multiple factors. I found in my life it could be multiple things. Sometimes it's my skin tone. Sometimes it's my accent. Yeah. I'll have people speak to me, and all of a sudden they're just like, "Oh wow, you speak really well. Wow.
You know how to talk, huh?"
Yeah. And I'm like, "Yeah, I studied English in school. Do you know what I mean? We were colonized by the British."
Yeah.
But I understand it, fundamentally, because it goes back to language in many ways, and that is, people have been programmed to identify language and the way people use language with who they are or what people believe they are. And so, depending on how I speak, depending on where people see me and how they see me, could even be how I wear my hair.
Yeah.
That could determine how people, conversate with me or how they treat me.
There was a time I believe you had cornrows. Is that?
I did, yeah, I did. That is a very unfortunate time, and I don't think
there
it's
was a perm
necessary.
involved
I don't
in that?
think
Is
it's
that correct?
necessary to bring that up. I think I've gone through enough pain in my life. That's not. I did. I had cornrows for a very long time. Jagged edge inspired my hair.
I think you should go back to that. I'm just saying. I wanted to go back to something you said. You mentioned you'd always aspired to American black culture. I think, when you first were named to host the Daily Show, everyone goes and looks up your entire history, and some black Americans were critical of kind of your comedy as it relates toward black Americans. They said that you either played on negative stereotypes or you questioned their authenticity as people of African descent. I want to get back to you. I will eventually get to the root of that comedy, but I want to ask you, as someone who was living in South Africa, what was your perception of Black Americans, and how has it changed over time living here now?
Wow, that's interesting. Growing up in South Africa, my perception of Black Americans was always, it was a perception that was created by movies and TV and music. And music played a big role in that. You know, I always saw these people who they were just the coolest cool that you could imagine. It was everything from watching Boys in the Hood to you know, the sitcom Martin, to, you know, whether it was Tupac and Biggie and, you know, and Puff. You were watching these people, these Black people who existed in a way that I had never seen before. They seemed to command respect in their world beyond just who they were, but also like how they made people around them feel and seem. Like there was a coolness attached to what they were doing that was really powerful. And I mean, that's one of the reasons that it permeated South Africa. I know I wasn't the only young Black person growing up in South Africa who identified with this. You were like, that's a piece of me. I can be that. You know, I can be that guy driving the Benz. I can be that guy, you know, living in a mansion. I can be that guy living a great life, wearing gold chains. Like it was aspirational. You know, it was aspirational beyond the circumstances that the people found themselves in. And so that was my identity. It was one that was limited, and it was stereotypical of one experience, and that's all I knew, and that was all I needed to know in a way.
Yeah. And what was the perception of Black Americans in terms of, like, I guess their connection to Africa? Because I remember my first time I went to Africa was South Africa a couple of years ago, and when I arrived, I literally wanted to like kiss the ground, because I feel like everyone from the diaspora, it's like you go to Africa and it's like, oh, I'm home, you know, it's what it feels like. But you know, quickly as I walked around, as people saw me, I could quickly tell that they could tell right away that I was not, you know, from the continent.
Right.
I'm curious, as far as the authenticity of Black people to Africa, I mean, what did you make of that, I guess?
Well, I think the mistake I made early on, and it's one that I was always bound to make because I had no direct information, was I didn't understand why Black Americans would aspire to Africa. I didn't understand why Black Americans were like, yo, the motherland, I got to get out there. You know, I didn't understand that. I was like, but why? So you guys are living an amazing life. You're wearing Timberlands and you're driving G-Wagons. Why would you want to come here? I honestly didn't understand it. So in many ways, I know I wasn't the only African way. I found it hilarious. I was like, it's funny because you don't realize how many Black Americans have been robbed of a place they believe is their home and a culture and a story. You take that for granted. You know, I come from a place where I can rattle off the history of my family without flinching. I can tell you about my ancestors. I can tell you about my culture. I can tell you why I do certain things because of the blood that is within me, you know? And that's something that you don't ever think of. I never thought of that. And so whenever we would hear that, you know, as myself and my friends would hear Black Americans saying that, or they'd come and they'd be like, oh man, I'm gonna kiss the ground, I'm home, baby, I'm home. And you'd be like, this is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. And then you understand beneath that funny, the pain that's attached to it. And then you understand why people want to connect with the story, because they've been robbed of that story. You know, and as you learn and as you read through the history of slavery and America and the slave trade as a whole, you come to realize how much you took for granted something that you never even thought of as a privilege, and that is knowing your story.
Yeah, that's great. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, that approach to comedy, and talk about, you know, it's a very divisive time, to say the least, especially when it comes to issues of race. Talk about humor, and how do you use that to maybe balance it out, balance the playing field a little bit?
Well, it's trial and error. You know, comedy is one of those formats where it's all about context. You know, I always say to people, I go, a joke is always limited to the relationship you have with your audience. And it doesn't matter if you're a comedian or just somebody telling a joke to your friend. The connection and the context you have, the relationship, is what provides all of the context. You can say something to a friend of yours that, if overheard, people would reel in horror. But your friend maybe shares a context with you, and that grows with an audience as well. You know, if you have an audience that grows with you in comedy clubs and starts doing shows with you, you know, as I had in South Africa, you start to grow a relationship. You know, going back to your previous question, It's what happened to me in America. When I first came to the United States, the rooms where I was given the most time and the rooms where I was most welcomed were the urban rooms, right? And that's where, I'd be doing shows like Chocolate Sundays in LA. I would be going out and I'd be performing, in Baltimore. I'd be doing shows that were predominantly black. And so I found my relationship to the audience was one that was contextualized by my perception of African Americans and their perception of Africa. And I played within that world, and I played with those stereotypes, breaking them down, turning them on their head, twisting it around. The mistake I made, and the one thing I regretted over time, was I took for granted how that comedy could be used against black people in America. Because I wrote all my comedy in black rooms.
But do you think if it's different if you say it versus if Chris Rock says it, being that he is from America? Like, is it kind of like if a white guy were to make a black joke, can they not do that? Do you think it's different?
Why? I think it's definitely different. If Chris Rock makes a joke, if I make a joke, and if a white comedian makes a joke, it is different in varying degrees. What I do know, though, is regardless, and this is from speaking to many comedians who are my mentors and friends, people like Dave Chappelle, there's nothing more hurtful than seeing somebody else taking your joke and using it in a way that you didn't intend it. So like I lived in a world where I genuinely only had the references that I did, and I would enjoy sharing that. And so you craft this set in black rooms all across America, and then you start getting opportunities to perform in mainstream rooms that are predominantly white. And you're doing that material, and you don't realize that the laugh is changing. The laugh is changing from recognition to ridicule. You don't realize that you've almost given people a key to laughing at as opposed to laughing with. And that was a shift that I then had to make in my comedy, where I was like, oh, okay, I'm trying to course correct and figure out what's happening here, because it was something I didn't understand until it was almost too late. And I was like, okay, that's something I promised myself that I would work harder on making sure that never happened again.
You also talked about understanding that history, where it comes from, that black people from America would really want to go back to Africa or want to, go back to the motherland and that type of thing. Obviously in South Africa, very recently you all have had a very horrible history with apartheid. Is there anything that you've learned about the horrific experience of not just black people, but other minority groups, whether it be Native Americans, Latinos, and whatnot? Anything that you've learned about their story or their history in America that's even surprised you at the level of the horror and the scrutiny and the things that marginalized people have to go through here?
Wow, is there anything that surprised me? Do you mean is there anything that hasn't surprised me? It's tough, especially when you read through it all. Lots of American history is delivered to you on the outside in tidbits, in snippets. You have ideas of it, but I won't lie, I didn't fully know, I didn't understand the complexities. And then you read through it. I remember one of the things that I guess surprised me and shocked me the most was when you come from the African continent, when you are an immigrant, you're prone to believing that all you have to do is behave, and then the world will treat you appropriately. And I remember the first time I discovered that that's exactly what black people in America had tried over and over again. It's why there was a movement of freedom fighters wearing suits. It's why black men in America dressed so dapper the way they did, because they said, I want to show you that I'm acting accordingly, I'm being respectful. And then seeing how even that wasn't enough, going through the stories, whether it was MLK or, whether it was reading stories of, in Oklahoma, reading all of these stories where you realize that it wasn't about what you were doing, it was more about who you are, which was a scary thought to come upon, because you always like to believe that there is something you can do to prevent you from being killed by a policeman, to prevent you from suffering the ills that your parents or your grandparents went through. You like to believe that it is all in your control. And I think one of the most surprising discoveries for me was realizing how far that was from the truth.
Speaking of, the horrible racial turmoil that you kind of, referenced there, let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump's America. You've talked about
I don't like to call it Donald Trump's America. I think it's
Donald
America.
Trump's presidency.
It's America dealing with Donald Trump.
Well,
It's not his America.
and my next line was from something you said, I think, in an interview with the LA Times. You talked about Trump is really just an antagonist in America's story, is the way you'd
Right.
phrased it. And I'm curious, in America, oftentimes the excuse is, oh, that was way in the past. That was very long ago.
Right.
South Africa, that excuse may not bear out so well because, I mean, it's more recent past. I mean, when I was over there, people always say, oh, we're only 20 years into this democratic
Right,
experiment.
right,
That was
right.
always the line. Do you think in some ways that the Trump presidency can be seen as a good thing for race in America in that it exposes kind of rifts that people thought were just gone in the past and didn't exist anymore?
Well, I don't know if it's a good thing. I think good can come from it. You know, that's how I've always lived my life. That's how my mother has taught me to live it. She goes, we can't control what's happening to us, but we can control how we react to it. And so in many ways you go, okay, Trump is president. This is the reality we are dealing with. This is the reality the world is dealing with, because it's not just an American issue now. Donald Trump is president, and he has in many ways emboldened people who are racist all over America. And so what has happened, and what good can come from it, in my opinion, is the fact that conversations can no longer be masked. Donald Trump is forcing people to choose. Donald Trump is in many ways, it's funny because, you know, the phrase was always used during the campaign. People would say, what would it take for people to not vote for Donald Trump? What would it take? And I'm like, well, Donald Trump's going to show you what it'll take. You know, he step by step, action by action, he slowly tests the resolve of people. And you see people slowly saying, actually, wait, is that what I look like? That's not me. That's not who I am. And as frustrating as it may be for some, you know, they go like, well, why weren't you against him from the beginning? I'm the eternal optimist, which is always going to be my downfall and my gift. And that is, I go, well, Donald Trump is the person who will push people to the point where they do have to make a choice. And it is sad because many people will still fall on the side of bigotry and xenophobia and racism. But there will be many who, seeing Donald Trump for what he is, will then choose to try and not be that. And not everyone may succeed, but I do believe that some people would then go, oh, I don't wish to associate with what that is. I didn't see myself as being that.
Given that you say you're the eternal optimist, and obviously where you came from a background and upbringing where you had to kind of dabble in all different races, cultures, and kind of bridge that divide, any tips or any words of encouragement you can give us now or for how this society, how here in America we can move forward in bridging a lot of these racial divides?
Wow, that's a tough one.
That's why I'm
I
a
would say
journalist.
the biggest thing is to talk about it. It's not easy, but I do know that's one of the most powerful tools you have. And when I say talk about it, I'm speaking to white people, predominantly in America. It's a frightening conversation to have, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, and that conversation is race. That conversation is understanding, you know, the very fiber of the country you are living in. Those conversations need to be had with your friends and family. And it seems like it's impossible. It seems like it's a mountain that can never be, climbed. But I do believe we can make inroads. I do believe that as people, we can move a conversation forward. But the key is to have that conversation. And I think in many ways, social media has done that. You know, I feel like younger people are more in touch with each other than ever before. We are seeing each other in ways that we never saw each other as human beings. You know, whether it's black people being shot by police in America, whether it's a bomb going off in Mogadishu and seeing the victims, whether it's people in Syria going through chemical attacks, you know, Assad launching attacks on them, whether it's us seeing what's happening in Myanmar with the Rohingya people. I don't think that many of those images would have filtered through to generations that came before us in the same way. There may have been one expose on the New York Times, a big piece, but for the most part, you find that would have blown over. And now we're in a space where we can see each other like never before. In many ways, I always say it feels like we're living through the best time ever because we now have the ability to see how bad things really are. which I know sounds like a paradox, but I feel like that's a hopeful place to be in.
Yeah, I think the lens is there, but I always kind of, maybe coming from my cynical thing, are people looking in the lens? Are people looking and accepting and trying to understand?
Well, I think people are looking. The acceptance is one that I can't necessarily speak to. You know, I do think, though, there is a shift slowly. You know, there will always be people who ignore. There'll always be people who turn the blame around. You know, you see it happening in all instances. It doesn't just happen to black people in America, where something happens and, you know, they go like, well, why was he running? Or why was he driving that car? Or why was he wearing a hoodie? Or the same thing happens to victims of sexual harassment or assault. We're seeing it now with Harvey Weinstein. People saying, well, why was she in that hotel room? Why was she wearing those clothes? Well, did she really want it? And that's a thing that we have to root out in society, is victim blaming. But what we can't deny is access to those stories does drill into people's minds. There will always be the holdouts. You know, I don't ever think we will get everyone. I don't think society needs everyone to move forward. Oftentimes, you will have the people who are left behind and they're forced to come with. They're always going to be dragging the rear end of society. And then there will be those people who are at the forefront. Most people, I argue, are in the middle, but they're also moving forward. And we have moved forward in society. You know, we've made progress, but that doesn't mean that more progress doesn't need to be made. That's how we live. And so I think having access to that is better than not having access to it, because at least people have to in some ways grapple with what's happening. Whether they agree with it or disagree, they're now grappling with it, which is a space I would rather be in.
One of the things you mentioned is we have to talk, we have to have conversations. And when we posted about this event on Facebook, I was looking at one of the comments, and there was a commenter who was saying, oh, Trevor Noah's coming. I must bet there must be lots of protests and burning down. They said, oh, no, wait, I guess not. And there's a sense among conservatives that there's definitely a double standard, especially here on college campuses, when you've seen with conservative speakers coming in,
right,
there being a lot of upheaval and uproar and whatnot. Do you think that college campuses are a little bit too close-minded in terms of bringing a diverse array of views when it comes to conservative, liberal, and whatnot?
That's an interesting question, because I haven't had personal experiences with every single college campus. I do know that it's a tough balance to maintain, you know, because on the one hand, we cannot deny that many conservative people have dabbled in the world of extreme views when it has suited them. You know, you will find establishment conservatives who in some way, shape, or form have condoned or allied themselves with people who have extreme views, you know, whether it's Nazism or, you know, whether it's genocide, or like you hear these ideas and you're like, how could you even be on the same page as this person? And so I think what invariably happens is there are many people who are afraid and go, we don't know who the Nazi is or isn't right now. And so we're going to protest all of these voices. I do believe, though, and maybe it's because I was a big fan of watching debates, not just in South Africa, but in America as well. You know, I would love watching Malcolm X on a stage debating somebody who wished he didn't exist as a human being. You know, I used to love watching those debates where James Baldwin would dismantle an idea and take it apart piece by piece. And something I always enjoyed about those debates was having the confidence in your ideas to put them up against ideas that you completely were against, and more importantly, you know, these ideas may have been against you even existing. But I always enjoyed the power of a good debate. You know, I also think people have to be careful, because on some of these college campuses, the people are specifically there to troll. And it's a tough decision to make as a person in a school. You go, do I let them speak, or do I? And I go like, but yeah, oftentimes they don't have the numbers you think they have. They're relying on you to amplify their voice. So you blocking them makes them a thing. Yeah. The story becomes about the blocking. Now people want to see what was blocked. You know, it's the same way when I was a kid. I always wanted to see in porno magazines what was hidden behind the stars. That's like, you want to know what's hidden, what's behind the blur. Now you've created suspense, you know, and it is tough. I'm not going to say it isn't, you know, because many people go like, how can I let you speak when what you're speaking about is me not existing? At the same time, that is the gift and curse of having a country where free speech is as applauded as it is.
Yeah. I think we have to get some questions soon, to some viewer questions soon, but I want to ask you just one more quick thing about college campuses. the idea of safe spaces, that's really been a big thing that people have been talking about lately, be it spaces where people of marginalized group can have kind of a safe environment on campus and whatnot.
Right.
Some schools like Northwestern University have come out and said, this is a thing we endorse. Other schools, like maybe the University of Chicago, have been less enthusiastic about something like that. Where do you fall on that? And I ask you this in the sense...
Did you just throw shade? Like, is this
what?
what, like...
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
It's like a turf war.
Somebody gave me the mic, so I got to use it. But I ask you that in the context of apartheid, because I mean, one thing you wrote about in the book is that what apartheid did is it allowed white people to not see the ramifications of what's happening in Alex, what's happening in some of the townships. And I sometimes wonder whether, could we have that same impact if we rely too much on safe spaces where people who might come from a small town where they've never met an Asian person or a Latino person will never interact with one?
What I'm always, branding in America fascinates me. Because like the term safe spaces is used many times to reference spaces where ethnic minorities are hanging out. And I don't know, I feel like everyone has safe spaces. Your safe space is just where you define it. Like conservatives have safe spaces as well. They have conservative conferences. Gun owners at the NRA, that's a gun owners conference. They'll go, that's our safe space. They, like, Fox viewers, that's their safe space. This is, I don't know, I feel like I'm being tricked, or I feel like there's something I'm missing here, but I go, you also do that. It's choosing. We do that as people. We say, oh, this is our group. Chess club is a safe space. In a way, like all of these things are safe spaces. It's just a group of people who say, we have a shared identity, we have a shared idea, we want to speak about this. Like those tiki torch assholes, that's a safe space. That's what they're doing. That's essentially the same thing. So I don't know if I agree with people going like, oh, you and your safe space over there. I go like, no man, everyone has a safe space. It's just that term has now come to be used in a way where it's like, oh, it means you're soft and no, everybody does that. Everybody finds a group of people that they relate to. And these are essentially clubs. That's what they are. So if you're at a university and you find there's a group of African students, they're going to want to find a club of Africans where they can have conversations where they don't need to be constantly translating. It'll be the same thing for a Jewish school where they'll go like, oh, this is our space where we get to just talk freely amongst ourselves and we don't have to explain anything. We don't have to worry about people getting anything out of context. And I think that's what it is. I think, though, the branding has been successfully used in such a way to make it seem like people are soft for wanting to engage in conversations where they don't need to translate to an outsider who may be listening to them. And I don't know. I don't think I buy into that.
Cool. Very well said. I think we got to get... So we had different college students submit videos, video questions, and we got a bunch of them. We've whittled it down to about 5 of them, so we're going to play them up here, and hopefully you have some good answers for them. So can we roll the first one if the technology works?
Hi Trevor, my name is Katie and I'm a senior at Bucknell University. Comedy is obviously a big part of what you do and who you are, and I know these days a lot of comedians are hesitant to do shows on college campuses because they believe that they're becoming too politically correct and intolerant, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are on this. In an effort to become more tolerant, are college campuses actually becoming intolerant of some forms of comedy? Thanks.
Well, that's an interesting question. When it comes to college campuses, I sometimes think that the younger generation is always going to be one that, or should always be one that forces progress, forces progressiveness. And people don't even realize it's happening, but it's always happening. I would argue that people in the South, even in America, who may consider themselves staunch conservatives, if they go back 60 or 80 years, they would find that, they were like the liberals of, they would be considered liberals according to those standards. When I think of comedy, many times when people go PC culture or those ideas, I think what people are just saying is, we've gotten to a place where we've come to realize the power of words. We've gotten to a place where we've come to realize that people don't have to accept being marginalized anymore. And we have to take more responsibility for what we say. Now, is there an overcorrection? Sometimes, yes. But for the most part, I know, even as myself as a comedian, I've had to learn these ideas. I didn't always know how to do it or what to do with it. I've lived in a world where there was a time when I thought that fat jokes were very funny, you know, because I came from a country where being overweight wasn't an epidemic. It wasn't a disease in many ways like it is in America. So I processed information differently. All of these ideas I find evolve over time. And so I still perform at college campuses. I still share my points of view. Some of my ideas may be edgy, but I don't think that it's a thing that we should shun. I think that corrections always need to be made. You know, there are some comedians who are really old now where you go like, well, you can't say that. You know, they'll say things that are crazy racist, and you'll be like, hey man, you can't be saying that. And then you'll find like a younger generation of comedian will say something else, you know, about maybe transgender people, where you go like, hey man, you can't say that. And I feel like every generation recalibrates what society does or doesn't accept, and that's a good thing. And so we're just in a period where that's happening again. I don't think it's a negative thing. In fact, I enjoy it. You know, I watch comedians who have successfully navigated that from generation to generation, and I believe that's why they've remained as successful as they have. You know, people like Chris Rock, who we mentioned earlier. He's done it from the time I was a young child, and he's still one of the best in the world at doing it. So clearly there are some comedians who know how to, you know, progress with the times, as opposed to saying, no, this is how I've always thought and this is how I will always think.
Can we go to second question, please?
Hello, I'm Tyler, and I'm from the George Washington University. And my question is, in this political climate, classroom discussions can often be divisive. What do you think is the best way to have an impactful and effective conversation amongst your peers?
What is the best way to have an impactful conversation amongst your peers? I think punching works really well. I'm trying to think. No, don't do that, please. No, someone's going to go punching. Trevor says punch jokes. I think we can always start from a place of empathy. One of the hardest things to do as people in a discussion or in a debate is operating from the point of view that the person you are speaking with is a human being. We often forget that. It's hard because sometimes the person you're speaking to doesn't think that you're a human being. And so I find in a debate, what really helps is thinking to yourself, what if I'm wrong? Just for a moment. Just think to yourself, what if I'm wrong? There are many times where we've been wrong. There's times when you're wrong, you have the wrong information, you've been brought up in the wrong way, you have the wrong idea of what the world is or how it works. And when I engage in a debate or when I'm trying to convince someone of something, I try and include that as my first port of call. I go, what if I'm wrong? Because this person thinks that they're right, I think that I'm right. This person thinks I'm an idiot the same way I think that they're an idiot. So something has to come from somewhere. So I go, if I'm wrong, then that person's right, this is their point of view, and then I go, let me take that point of view and see if I can dissect it from that side, as opposed to just spitting out my dogma consistently. You go constantly. I don't go, this is the only truth. I say, well, let me take your truth then and poke holes in it. And you'll come to find that when you do that, not only will you understand the person you're speaking to a little bit more, but you may be able to converse with them in a way that they may understand a little bit more. And you won't always win. And sometimes I find the debate is not to change the person you're debating with. The debate is often for the people who are watching. The audience are the ones who are choosing between the ideas that are being presented to them. So in that classroom, you may not be convincing the person you're speaking to, but somebody listening may be swayed because they see that your point of view or the ideas that you are sharing are ones that are superior or preferable to them.
Do you find that happening on The Daily Show much? I think the one that people most point to, the Tomi Lahren, having her on the show, and obviously she's a very different point of view. Do you find yourself engaging in that level and putting your place in yourself in their mindset and what they're thinking?
Yeah, I always like to, because otherwise, how do you know your ideas are good if you don't test them? You know, I don't want to live in a world where I believe everything I believe because I've been told it, and I just reinforce that idea myself. I like to challenge my ideas. I like to know why I believe what I believe. You know, because every idea we have didn't come from our minds. It has come from the world in some way, shape, or form. You know, very few ideas are completely sparked from the genius within our own minds. And so what I like to do is have someone who can test my point of view to force me to galvanize my ideas. And in doing that, I can then question them. I can bring an idea back to them. Like I remember when Tommy came on the show, that was one of the key questions that came up because of the conversation we're having. And it was, a common conservative talking point, which was black people shouldn't be protesting like this, shouldn't be. And then I honestly, in the moment, I just asked the question. I said, okay, when is the right time to protest? And I still haven't gotten that answer from anyone. Like I genuinely haven't. I haven't heard any conservative person saying, this is when it's acceptable for black people to protest. And so I think in those moments, you wouldn't have gotten to that place because you wouldn't have had anyone challenging your point of view.
Let's go to question 3, please.
My name is Maggie Siegfried. I'm a student at the University of Delaware, and my question is, despite all the chaos in our country regarding fake news and the widespread distrust of media, what advice do you have for college students trying to enter the field?
Oh, what advice do I have for students trying to enter the field? Well, I think now we're living through an age where more than ever there is a power that you have, if you're trying to enter journalism that you never had before. There are journalists everywhere in this room. Everyone who has a phone has become a journalist. Everyone who has a Twitter account has become a journalist. In many ways, you have the power to not only garner information, but also share it with the world around you. And so I would say to all those people who are entering the field, I go, this is a time that we're living through, and hopefully this will not become the norm. You see countries all over Africa, countries like Russia, for instance, where the government has found the apparatus they need to keep perpetuating the idea that there is no such thing as real. But there is real. There are facts. Facts still exist. And so if you're getting into the field of journalism, just believe in that. Keep hammering home those facts, because at the end of the day, they are real. They will come to your aid in sharing a story. And sometimes it's frustrating because they may not bear fruit when you would like them to, but a fact is a fact is a fact. And at the end of the day, that fact cannot change. And so for anyone getting into journalism, I tell them, I go like, if anything, this is just the beginning. It may be the era of fake news, coined by the president who invented that word. But I do think this is the best time to be involved in it because people are listening.
Are you a journalist? Do you consider yourself one?
No. I rely on the work of journalists. Yeah, that's what I do. I give my opinions on what is happening in the news, but without journalists, I couldn't do what I do. I need to be informed as well. And so, if it wasn't for journalists to go out there and find the stories, unearth everything from what's happening in North Korea to Niger to California to Harvey Weinstein scandal, I wouldn't know what I know. And that's the joy of living in a country where you have a free press, is you have access to information and knowledge.
Can we go to the next question, please?
Hi, my name is Dion Gray, and I'm from James Madison University. My question for you is, how has being born in another country affected your credibility in the United States?
How has my being born in another country affected my credibility? I think that's a double-edged sword, I found. Like most things in life, it's a gift and a curse. On one hand, people will say to me, you're not from here. Why would you comment? Why do you have an opinion? Why do you have an idea? I often say to people, I go, well, I'm still a human being. I still live in the world. A lot of these ideas we're dealing with are not specifically American. They're ideas and issues that society has to deal with. It's all too painful for me to realize how many issues Americans deal with that South Africans deal with and had to deal with during apartheid. So when I look at that, I go, I understand some people would think, oh, we shouldn't listen to you because you're not from here. We shouldn't care about your opinion. And I understand that point of view. At the same time, I argue some of the greatest, help that came in the world, like for South Africa, came from the world. We had Americans who were speaking up for us in South Africa, and we didn't say, why do you care, you're not from here? The same thing happened in the UK. There were people, there's always people who care about something that does not involve them, and I've always thought that's what the world should be more like. One of the things that I hope to use to my advantage is not being from here, because then I don't take anything at face value. I ask the questions. You know, I've come to realize that I'm an idiot, and I enjoy that mantle, because when you're an idiot, and when you accept it, by the way, it's a very scary thing to accept. But when you accept it, you start to enjoy life, because you ask questions. You're not afraid to be an idiot because you know you're one. So then you just ask, why? And then you'll be shocked at how many people don't actually know the answer. You know, and so that's all I aim to do, because I don't understand the Electoral College. And so I would ask that question to someone who goes like, well, that's just how it works. And I go like, but why? And the why? And then get to a point where you're like, well, okay, slavery and no. You know, just asking the why over and over again gets you to a place where oftentimes it's not just me that's discovering this information, but it may be my friends or my colleagues in America who also go, I actually don't know why, and no one has ever asked me why, and so now we can dig into that why. And that is something that I choose to use to my advantage. So some people may think that impacts my credibility, some people may think that it doesn't. I like to go, I don't need to be credible or not. I'm giving you an opinion. You know, I'm giving you an opinion, and I'm sharing facts with you. You know, I work on a show where I have a team of fact checkers, you know, and some of the best in the world, and they rein me in. They go like, you can't say that, this is the fact. And I'll fight against it, but it's a fact, and so I have to say it. And the best comedy is based in truth. And I'm trying to make the best comedy possible, so I will always be bound by the truth. And that's the only credibility that I feel I need.
Thank you. I think we got one more question to go, please.
Hi, Trevor. My name is Stephanie, and I go to Penn State. And my question for you, being someone who works in the media, and you obviously have to deal with a lot of comments and people's thoughts on your appearance or things you say. So I guess my question is, how do you deal, what are your self-help tools, and how do you deal with the constant negativity that you get on a media platform?
Wait, I get constant negativity? Well, what timeline is she reading?
She's reading the conservative ones, I guess.
You know what I've come to learn is, as crazy as this sounds, most of it is not real. I know that's not a popular standpoint to have, but I've just come to learn most of it is not real. You can choose most of what you accept into your world. You know, I have a good friend and a very wise man by the name of Joseph Opio, who he always says to me, he goes like, why do you care about this world? So some random person will tweet you from anywhere, and now you care? Why? Why do you care? You go, well, because the person tweeted me. And he's like, yeah, but if that person didn't tweet you, then what would change in your life? You know, it's an idea. You know, and there are not many ideas that you can escape in the world. There are some things that are happening to you physically. We cannot deny that. But there are many things that are also an idea of what is happening to you. And you know, as much as we cannot control what is happening to us, we can control how we react to it. And maybe we've been brought up to believe that we cannot, but we can. You can choose many times how to react. You can choose to not read through your mentions online. You can choose to not interact with trolls. You can choose to not get baited into a conversation that you know is just going to wind up in trolling. You know, you can choose a lot of these things, even though you believe you cannot. Some people say, I don't have the luxury of choosing. Yeah, I get that, but you're still making a choice. And so I've come to learn that I can focus my energy on moving an idea forward. I've come to learn that I will focus my energy on learning and trying to be a part of something that is positive. I've come to learn that obviously people are not going to like you. And that's what you should accept in life, is people who don't like you won't like you because you stand for something. If everybody likes you, then you're doing nothing. So for me, it comes with the territory. Love me or hate me, but don't be indifferent. And that's the way I'll live my life.
And I guess... And what you say about, you know, how you respond, or what, I guess people forget that there was a time when there was no Twitter. So it's
right.
like...
And I know it's hard, especially when you're young. Like, this thing, it's now our world, you know? We feel like we can't get rid of it. It's become this vice, but we can. Yeah. We can. There are moments when you can completely disengage. Just imagine your battery died whenever you want to escape. Just be like, it's dead. And then that's it. And then you're just like, oh, look how much nicer. Just take a break for a weekend. Just quit it all, you know? Read the news that you need to read. Keep up with what you need to keep up with. Stay away from the conversations when you want to stay away from them. And you'll be surprised to find you can focus on the positivity in your world, and that'll give you the energy to deal with the negativity when you choose to.
Good, and I think we're wrapping up here soon, but I got one more question for you from my end. You're a comedian, you're a very funny guy. Is there a joke about race that you can tell us that might get you in trouble on Twitter tomorrow?
Huh. Is there a joke I could tell you
a
about?
white guy, a black guy walk into a bar type thing, you know?
I never know which one will get you into trouble. That's the weird thing about the world. I wish I could tell you one that would. And I don't have those kinds of jokes. I tell stories, if anything. I share anecdotes. I share ideas. Yeah, I don't have any. I'm ashamed to say I don't have any that would get me into trouble on Twitter. If I have one, I'll tweet it later, and then you let me know how it goes.
There you go. Tweet it at NY Times.
Yeah, you retweet it, and then we see what happens. We let the outrage build overnight, and we deal with it tomorrow.
Okay, great. So, Trevor, thank you so much for your time, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank you all for coming out. This has been a great conversation. Again, please keep the conversation going on. Like all of our college students, go to email oncampus@nytimes.com. Tell us your stories about race, how you've identified in college campuses. And we thank everyone here for being here. We thank everyone for watching online. And please keep the conversation going. And for those of us here in the room, we'll be doing a small Q&A just with myself afterwards. So if you want to stick around, please feel free. And once again, let's give it up for Trevor Noah. Thank you so much, Trevor.
Thank you, everybody.